Joining me for this segment of Reaching Out is Councilman Ritchie Torres of the Bronx. Richie is the new chairman of the New York City Council Public Housing Committee. And Richie spells his name Ritchie. Kind of unusual spelling. Can you tell us about the genesis of that spelling?
It is. I mean, Richie's normally spelled as Richie, as in Richie Rich. But my name includes a T because my mother was watching La Bamba when she was pregnant with me. And so she named me after Ritchie Valens. And Ritchie Valens is spelled as Ritchie. So La Bamba is the roots behind my name.
Do you have any music in your background? Do you play any music?
No, I have no musical talent at all. So it was the lack of musical talent that led me into politics. So.
Public housing and NYCHA are the greatest concerns to Local 237 members. We make up the workforce in NYCHA, and many of our members live in public housing. You had an historical committee meeting in the New York City public housing out in Coney Island. Can you tell us what brought that about and what were the effects and what were the results of that meeting?
You know, I feel strongly that we're in the midst of a progressive moment, and the city council has to think about how do we govern in a new way? How do we govern in a way that's more participatory? And so I said, why not bring the first ever public housing committee hearing to a public housing development? You had thousands of public housing residents living in developments hit hard by Hurricane Sandy, where there were no permanent boilers. And so we held a hearing in a Coney Island development. And less than a month after our hearing, it was so historic, so highly publicized, that you had the mayor and the state senator, U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer announce that FEMA has agreed to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in boiler replacement. So the publicity that we were able to draw to the crisis of emergency boilers at those developments made a difference. You now have hundreds of millions of dollars available in federal funding for the installation of permanent boilers in those housing developments hit hard by Hurricane Sandy.
And at the hearing, the residents testified that the boilers do not work when the temperature reaches below 40 degrees. These boilers were housed on the outside of the development, and they actually froze up, so they were giving off no heat. And we know as New Yorkers, this was a brutal winter, and the chances of it getting below 40 degrees was probably every day this winter.
Yeah. I mean, you had a perfect storm. You had one of the harshest winters in recorded history. You had housing developments that had temporary boilers that break down at a much faster rate. So to have those two circumstances put together, you had tenants who were so desperate for heat that they were putting on the stove in their apartments, risking exposure to carbon monoxide. It had a particularly destructive effect on senior citizens. And we heard their painful stories at the hearing. And it powerfully resonated with me.
And it was actually a perfect storm that caused this situation that flooded. It was Hurricane Sandy that flooded the basements, and the boilers were rendered incompatible, and it was the boilers were destroyed, basically.
Exactly. So, and so it's not enough to simply repair the boilers. We have to rebuild them, and we have to bring them into a state of resiliency and elevate them so that in the event of a future storm, these boilers are protected, and you don't have residents who are going multiple heating seasons without a permanent boiler. I mean, that's unacceptable.
Now, you said FEMA's agreed to provide monies for the boilers. Do we know of any plan that the New York City Housing Authority has to install new boilers yet?
So my understanding is that the New York City Housing Authority is in the process of developing a plan, and then FEMA is, rather than challenge the New York City Housing Authority, will accept whatever cost estimates come with the plan. So FEMA is actually going to defer to NYCHA's cost estimates as long as there's an independent party that says that those estimates are accurate, in which case I think it's going to be the Department of Buildings. So it looks like NYCHA is going to get the funding that it needs to not only rebuild these boilers, but to bring them into a state of resiliency.
That sounds very good. We look forward to
so again, that hearing made a difference.
Plans. Yes.
I mean, the council's role is not only to pass laws, but to oversee city agencies, and the hearings that we hold can make a difference. And in pressuring the state and the federal government to invest more resources in NYCHA.
Now, there are so many issues that are making life terribly difficult for residents and workers at NYCHA developments. We'd just like to hear your perspective on which of those issues that you feel are most paramount.
Well, we have to recognize the importance of public housing to the fabric of our city. You know, there's been much conversation about affordable housing, much conversation about homelessness. I would submit to you that the best affordable housing program we have is public housing. Public housing houses about 5% of the city. It makes up well over 8% of the city's rentals. You know, we saw that the end of rental subsidies led to homeless shelters that were housing tens of thousands of people. If we lost public housing, we would have homeless shelters housing hundreds of thousands of people. So it is critical to making sure that New York City remains affordable. And unlike most of the affordable housing that we've seen created, public housing is universally affordable. It makes your rent 30% of your gross adjusted income. So it's critical that we preserve it. And what we've seen over the last few decades is disinvestment at every level of government. You have fewer and fewer federal dollars going to public housing. We have the largest public housing stock in North America, not only in the country, but in the continent of North America. And
probably the world.
Could be the world. Yeah. And public housing gets no money from the state. No money from the state.
Or the city.
We have a $140 million budget and not a single dollar from the state. I think that it's a scandal, and I want to do everything I can to expose it. And not only is the city failing to invest resources in NYCHA, but we siphon resources away from NYCHA. I mean, NYCHA has to pay the NYPD upward of $70 million a year. It did receive temporary relief this year, but normally would have to pay upward of $70 million to the NYPD. It makes upward of $20 million in what are known as pilot payments to the Department of Finance, payments in lieu of taxes. And all these fees and payments that NYCHA makes to the city amount to upward of $300 million a year. And those are $300 million that are not spent on repairs, not spent on capital improvements, not spent on making sure that every public housing resident has access to a decent life.
Former Governor George Pataki stopped funding NYCHA. NYCHA was getting about $60 million a year from the state. And Giuliani followed, and Bloomberg kept up that policy. NYCHA was getting about $30 million from the city for its developments. So it was roughly $90 million a year going back over 10 years. So we're talking about $900 million to $1 billion lost in revenue for NYCHA.
That's exactly right. I think in the late 90s, the state decided to no longer fund public housing. And then since 2001, the federal government has only been providing NYCHA with what is known as a proration, only a percentage of the eligible funding that it needs to keep the public housing stock in a state of good repair. And then in about 2003, the city decided to no longer fund public housing. And, for me, that's unacceptable. I mean, if you had a private landlord who one day decided to no longer fund the maintenance of his own building and everything fell into disrepair, the bricks and the roof and the boilers fell into disrepair, that landlord would be liable for civil, if not criminal penalties. But when the city or state does it, there's no consequence at all. And that's unacceptable.
Crime is going up. Violent crime and the fear associated with that. NYCHA had money in the past for security cameras. Yeah. Do we know how much money NYCHA has for security cameras? And two, if there's a plan to implement the security cameras?
One problem is that, well, first I think I want to point out that, we have to be careful not to stigmatize public housing or public housing residents. We have to recognize, the Daily News did report that even though the city only saw a 3% rise in major crime, public housing saw a 31% rise in major crime. So public housing developments, are seen as more dangerous than the city at large. Having said that, we have to recognize that most of the crime, both in public housing and in the city at large, is committed by a small, select set of criminals.
Sure.
And that most of the residents are law-abiding and productive citizens. And that's something that I feel it's important to put out there. But there's no dedicated funding stream for security enhancements in public housing. It all depends on on member items, which varies from member to member. I'm going to invest about $4 million of my own member items in installing cameras and layered access control in my own developments, but there is no citywide dedicated funding stream to ensure that every development is safe, that it has cameras, it has layered access control, it has lighting upgrades, it has an active resident watch program, it has all the elements of security. There is no citywide commitment to providing that to our public housing residents, and I feel that's unacceptable.
There is a gang problem.
Yeah.
We have problems with gangs in NYCHA. No one wants to talk about it.
It is a serious problem, yeah.
We have the need to have programs for our children after school, computer programs, daycare. We need someone to make sure that we have basketball programs, something for the youth to do. We need those programs implemented. What developments do you represent?
I represent Parkside houses in Allerton, the neighborhood of Allerton. I represent Twin Parks East and Murphy and 1010 East 178th Street in East Tremont and West Farms. I represent Twin Parks West in Fordham Heights, and Twin Parks West is a particularly dangerous development where a Postal Service employee was pistol whipped in the lobby, and so that's going to be a priority for cameras, and then Monterey houses as well. So I represent a significant stock of public housing throughout the district. But I want to address, I think there are three important facts about crime. We have to bear in mind that a disproportionate share of the crime is committed by young people.
Yes.
Youth violence. It's committed by gangs.
Yes.
And it's committed in public housing. And so we need a strategy for reducing crime that focuses on all those three elements. I do feel like the NYPD is becoming more effective at cracking down on gang violence. There is a program known as Operation Crew Cut.
Okay.
And it has three core elements. The first is that it dramatically increases the size of the gang division. Right? It doubles the size of the gang division. The second is it not only focuses on the established gangs, the Bloods and the Crips, but on street crews, on gangs that are based around a building or a neighborhood that have their own, minute identity. And it not only follows these gangs on the streets, but it follows them on social media. Social media has been a huge source of intel.
Yes.
You have gangbangers who are bragging about their criminal exploits on Facebook or Instagram, and the police have been able to use the intel to crack down on these gangs. So Operation Crew Cut, for me, is much more effective than, say, stop and frisk. Because stop and frisk, you're targeting every person of color in a neighborhood. It's a broad brush. Whereas Operation Crew Cut, you're focusing specifically on known criminals. And so that's a targeted, tailored, much more responsible approach to policing.
Thank you. Fortunately, that's all the time we have for this segment of Reaching Out. Very special guest was Councilman Ritchie Torres. He's the chair of the Public Housing Committee, New York City Council. Thank you for coming on Reaching Out.
It was an honor to be here, and look, you're a true partner in advocating for public housing residents. So this is the beginning of a long-standing relationship.
Thank you, and we got to have you back after
I
your story.
will be a regular guest. So
thank you.
Take care.
Okay.